Good morning to everyone. This is the Meaningful Interviews program for Rabbi Chaim Dolphin, and today we have Mrs. Chana Sharfstein, who needs no introduction, but I'll introduce her anyway. Mrs. Sharfstein has been on my radar for 20, 30 years, ever since I had the opportunity to host her daughter in a camp that I ran in Northern California, Razy, and her good work, both in Chabad and out of Chabad, her special tours, and of course, being the daughter of Rabbi Yisroel Zuber, I believe, who learned in Lubavitch by the Rebbe Rashab. And everyone knows that one of my great loves is writing about Hasidim of the past, their history, and I've documented much of this in many of my works, my books. So Mrs. Sharfstein is noted for her own right, but also because of her family, where she comes from. And of course, her late husband, Rabbi Sharfstein, who I would see around Crown Heights. And recently, I wrote a book called Chabad and Orthodoxy. It's one of my last books between 1900 and 1950. And it's really a study of the Previous Rebbe of Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson's trip to America in 1929 and 1930. And I found out that the Sharfsteins were very involved with a shul in Manhattan, I think on Henry Street, I forget. And I have quite a bit of information. I think, Mr. Sharfstein, you'll be amazed at what we put together. Found out some intricate details from various scholars and historians about the various shuls. And I believe that the Frierdiker Rebbe even said a Maimon Chassidus in the shul that your late husband and his father and his brother belonged to in the Lower East Side, right? So it's very appropriate that we have you on, and I say welcome to you, and please tell us a little bit about your background. And my understanding is that you, as a little girl, I imagine about 8 to 10 years old, without divulging your age, of course, met the Frierdiker Rebbe in Sweden on his way out of Nazi Germany, and he was saved from the Holocaust. And I think what I read and heard is that you remember the Rebbe with the 10 other people who were saved, and they went through Sweden, and your father, Oliver Sholem, was the main facilitator of that part of his journey. So please tell us a little bit about it. Thank you.
Well, I grew up in Stockholm, Sweden, where my father was a Rav. He was a Rav in a shul called Adas Yisrael. And yes, it was a very high point in our lives when the Frierdiker Rebbe came to stop there. And my father was so enormously excited because he hadn't seen him since they had been together in Riga, Latvia, which was in the 30s. And this was 10 years later. And I remember that we were all in a suite of rooms in a very, very elaborate hotel, which is still the most important hotel in Stockholm, even today. It's the Grand Hotel, and it's where the Nobel Prize winners stay when they come to get their awards. And it's across the street, across the water from the Royal Palace. And I remember being led up by my father to the Rebbe. Each one of us came up to the Rebbe to get a special bracha. And the Rebbe put his hands on my head, and I felt that I was like in a cloud. He was a very big man. To me, he was a big man physically. He was like robust, and he was seated in a wheelchair. And I was fascinated by this golden pocket watch that he had. He had it in his pocket, and then it went across his chest. And he puts his hand on my head, and he asked me what my name was. And I was bilingual, of course, speaking Yiddish and Swedish. So I told him in Yiddish that my name is Chana. And he gave me a big bracha, and he said, that's a beautiful name, and I should always cherish the name.
Beautiful. And what was your father's involvement as the Rav? He was the main Rav of Stockholm, right?
He was the main Rav of Stockholm, and I would say he was really the main Rav of Orthodoxy in all of Sweden, because Stockholm was by far the largest center of Jewish life in Sweden. And he was a Moel. He traveled all around all the Scandinavian countries before everything was closed up during the Hitler era. He traveled to make a bris to all the Scandinavian countries, to Norway and to Denmark and to Finland, and of course in Sweden. And he was in charge of the Schritte, which was a very big problem later on, because there was a whole big thing about inoculating the animals, so that according to the people who were very much into animal rights, that they should be inoculated. So a whole different problems. And he was in charge of everything that had to do with halacha. He even published a sefer that was called Zichron Yaakov, which deals with special halachas that have to do what time you can daven, what time you can bench, and things like that, because it's like really hard for people to understand. But summertime, Shabbos ends like midnight, and Shabbos begins like in the summertime in July, begins like at 9-10 o'clock at night. So you have to really know when can you daven shacharis and all these things. So
right. Now, what year did he and you, your family, leave Stockholm for America?
1947.
So, is it your education, your chinuch, was in the local schools, and could you, what did you walk away with as a frum Lubavitch girl in Stockholm?
Well, we had a wonderful secular education in the schools there. There were no day schools because there weren't enough people to make any day schools. We had a little Talmud Torah after the refugees came on the fishing boats from Denmark. Then we ended up having a little bit of an international school. It's hard to believe that in a city of Stockholm with 500,000 inhabitants, there were only 2 Jewish girls besides me. It's like hard to believe that. And then when the Danish Jews came, we had a teacher from Denmark, and we had a good daughter that was a rabbi. Her father had been the rabbi in Norway. He was never killed by the Germans there. Her name was Samuels. And then there were some girls from Denmark. So we had like a whole little Talmud Torah, and that was very exciting. I think there were 4 or 5 of us. The schools, the secular education was incredible. It was like way above and beyond what was being taught in schools in most other countries, even the United States. And we had private tutors for Hebrew studies.
That's very interesting that there were only two Jewish girls in Stockholm those days. That's amazing. Let me ask you, did you feel envious of your non-Jewish girlfriends, friends?
Why would I be envious of them? There was nothing to envy. They had, they were all very good friends with me in school. I participated in all the activities and things. They even had school on Shabbos. Of course, I was home, and they would come every Shabbos afternoon from school. They would come and bring me the work so I could cover it on Sunday, because we had to have special permission from the king to stay home every Shabbos. Mm-hmm. So you had to cover the work. But no, why would I be envious of them? I mean, the home was very, very strong. The home was really, really the center of our lives.
Your father talked a little bit about his days in Lubavitch and his family. Chassidim, I think you told me they came from Shedrin, going back. The Tzemach Tzedek, was the one who made those colonies for Lubavitch, Chassidim, and others. Did he talk a little bit to you? And did you had siblings?
Yes, I was the youngest. I had 2 older brothers, and I have an older sister. She was a shlucha in Springfield for all the years that she was married.
Right. Rebbetzin Edelman, right.
Right.
So did your father talk about Lubavitch, about his years in yeshiva?
Yes, he did. They were very, very difficult years, because he went there as a young boy. I don't even know if he was bar mitzvah yet. And of course, there was no cell phone, and there were no phones, and there were no letters from home. And you went to live there in Tomchei Tmimim, and the food was very meager. They had like really, really not large amounts of food. and he became a chain smoker. People smoked because that was a way to still their hunger and keep them awake. He told me about how they used to take they would learn all night because they loved learning, and they would learn by candlelight because they didn't have electricity in those places. And then they would take, when the candles became very small, they would save the little stumps of candles and they melt them together and make new candles out of it. Like everything had to be done very sparingly. And the only time that they really had a good meal was when they went on Shabbos, when they were treated by hosts in the city.
Did he talk about the Rebbe, the Rashab? Did you remember anything he said about the Rashab?
Just that he sent him when he was just a young bacher. He must have been like no more than 18, 19. And he sent him, there was a war going on, of course. There were always wars going on, the Bolshevik Revolution, whatever. And he sent him to read the Megillah for the people at the army. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time that he acted as a shliach, and he went to the army and he read it to them. And then when he came back, the Rebbe Rashab wanted all the details of what happened and how it worked out. And he wanted every single iota of what had happened. He was so interested in it.
Mm-hmm. Who was like a very good friend of his that made it to America that he would speak about? Anyone in particular?
Well, he knew all the people that were here. It was a very disappointing experience because he was in Riga together with the Lubavitch Rebbe and the entourage. They were all in Riga in the late 1920s, early 30s. And he had 4 siblings in the United States. He had 3 sisters and a brother. And you needed a visa to come. So, of course, like once you had left Russia and you were in Riga, Latvia, you were on your way, because Riga, Latvia was an independent Baltic country already. So you were never going to go back to Russia from there, because Russia was communist revolution with Stalin, and it was just an awful situation. And so they were waiting to get visas from the United States. And guess what? Nobody gave him a visa, because he was a father with a small family with 3 children at that point. I wasn't around yet. And it was terrible because the situation in America had just had the market crash. And people were on bread lines and nobody had money. So nobody was going to say, I am going to vouch for this man to come with his family when they could barely support themselves. So that's why he ended up in Sweden, actually. The Friedrich Rebbe told him to go to Sweden and gave him a big bracha to go there.
Uh-huh. And that's very interesting. So he comes to America, so he came 1947, and he survived the war because they didn't come into Sweden. How was it that he survived?
Yes, we were really, really lucky. We were really lucky. It was like we were in the midst of everything falling apart around us. I mean, Sweden and Norway have a common border. That's the Scandinavian peninsula. Norway was invaded, and half of their men were killed as soon as they came to Auschwitz. And their really Jewish community was really scattered and taken apart. On the other side, south of us, was Denmark. And Denmark, they were very lucky. King Christian X, he was the one who said that he doesn't separate his citizens. The Jews are Danes like everybody else. So he said they don't have to wear a star. And if anyone wears a star, then I'm going to wear the star too, because we're all one group of people. And so they were able to rescue 98% of the Danish Jews, and they came to Sweden. And Finland, that was very interesting. Finland fought together with the Germans, on the side of the Germans, against Russia. But they sent their children for safekeeping to Sweden. So we had a little Finnish boy living in our home for 2 years until the parents came after the war.
That's amazing. Amazing, the divine providence, how your family was saved and other people. Now, so you come to America in 1947. Did you come straight to Boston or to New York or elsewhere?
Well, actually, my father had a contract, and I have a copy of the contract. It was a legal contract signed by Rabbi Gorari. It was a contract that told how much money he was going to make as Rosh Yeshiva of Tomchet Tamimim of the whole Lubavitch Yeshiva on Bedford and Dean. He was going to be the Rosh Yeshiva, the really big top man there. And that was just a position that was totally suitable for him. He was a scholar and he was a Talmud Chacham. And this is what he really would have been very good at. And so he packed up his precious library and he came on that Tanai. But then while in the interim, he was waiting for my sister because she was over 18 and she had to get her own passport. So it took a few months till everything was cleared up. And in the interim, the one who had been in charge in Otwock in Poland of the Chabad yeshiva, this Rabbi Guzman, he reappeared on the scene and everybody had thought that he wasn't alive anymore, but he had ended up in Russia during the war. And of course, till he got out from there and he was able to communicate, all of this happened. And then the Rebbe said that he needed to get the position back to him because he had had it before. And that's how we ended up in Boston.
Uh-huh. And did someone call him then to Boston? Why Boston?
The Yiddishe Rebbe sent him there.
And to send him there, what, to be a Rav?
He sent him there to be a Rav at the Chabad Shul in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is part of Boston, and to be part of the day school that they had there. They had a children's day school, the Lubavitch Yeshiva in Boston.
Right,
yes.
Right. Now, I heard from your nephew, Rabbi Yisroel Edelman, who's named after your father, right?
Right.
He told me that your father attended Rabbi Soloveitchik's shiurim, and he had a very good relationship with Rabbi Soloveitchik. Does anything come to mind when I mentioned that?
Well, my father was like very good friends with all the Rabbanim. There was a Rabbi Savitsky in Boston also. Right. And my father became very quickly a member of the Vat HaRabbanim in Boston, and he was recognized as one of the authorities there. And they all respected him and he respected them. So he was on good terms with all of them.
Right. But did you know the Soloveitchik girls growing up?
Well, they really kept very much to themselves. They really didn't associate with any people. They went to school and they stayed home. They didn't belong to any of the organizations or participate in any of the activities that the rest of us did.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Now, I also recall reading in various publications that our Rebbe had, and you had a very special relationship in the especially in the early years in the 50s. Am I correct? And I think it had also to do with your shidduch and a sheitel. It's mixed up, but maybe you want to share a little bit about that.
Well, it was very, very unfortunate and very tragic that my father lived through the Bolshevik Revolution. He lived through the era of Stalin. He lived through like really hazardous times, the World War II era, all the terrible things. And of course, needless to say, even though we were not, thank God, involved in World War II per se, we were very much touched by it, because when the white buses came and took the refugees from the camps, the survivors, and brought them to Sweden, they were the first stop that they had. So my father was like the first one to really hear all the terrible stories of what had happened to them. So he was aware of all the horrible things that had happened during that entire era. And then we came to the United States and we thought that Boston, America, Boston, cradle of liberty and all that stuff. My father was actually killed there. And that was really a big tragedy. It was only 5 years after we came. And nobody ever solved it. It was like, a mystery crime. But he was attacked apparently by, probably we think, a group of young teenagers. And they threw him to the ground. He suffered a brain concussion. And the next day he was nifter. So that was only after 5 years. So that was very tragic. And of course, I was left fatherless at a young age. And then 5 years later, my mother was nifter. But in between that, we went to see the Rebbe, and I got very much involved with the Rebbe. And he kind of became a substitute father, I must say.
How old was your father when he was murdered, when he passed away?
55.
55. And that was in 1955 or 52?
1953.
1950.
1953.
1953. So just tell us one thing that stands out from Yechidus with the Rebbe during those years with you, something that really shows not just him being like a father to you, which of course is very significant, but how the Rebbe understood women. I think one of the reasons I really wanted to interview you, and I want to continue with other women, is to show the young women today the future, the future of our people, how women can and need to be leaders like yourself. And I mean it. Ich sage es von mein Herz. To bring the message of Torah and Yiddishkeit and Hasidishkeit to the world. So tell us something about that the Rebbe and you conversed and discussed, and even maybe debated and argued. Just I want to hear.
Well, it was amazing because the first time I came to see the Rebbe was just a few months, maybe 2-3 months after my father had been nifted. My mother came to see the Rebbe because she was like completely overwhelmed and lost. It was a new country, a new experience, new language, new culture. And there she was left, a young widow, and it was just overwhelming. So I sat quietly and listened while she was talking to the Rebbe, and then he started talking to me, and I was amazed at how easy he was to talk to. And he would sit there and, you felt that he was listening to every word that you said. He was like an incredible listener. I think today people have lost the art of listening. Everybody's so busy with Twitter and Facebook and all these media things that they have to always give information and give, but nobody knows how to listen. And the Rebbe was an incredible listener. So when I came to New York by myself, I just felt like seeing him because he was such a great listener. And what amazed me tremendously was that he could recall a conversation that we had had 3-4 months before and recall in detail what we had discussed and what I had responded. And it was like, I could barely remember the whole thing until he started to say it. And then I remembered that, yes, I did say all those things. And that was like really, really overwhelming. He amazed me because he brought up the subject about love. And that was like, everybody wants to know about that. No, it's not written down. It's not in a letter. It was a conversation. And I had no intentions of discussing anything like that with the Rebbe because I didn't think that that's what you do. So he brought up the topic, and I was amazed because I had told him before he asked me what my hobbies were and what I enjoyed doing, and I said I loved reading. So he said to me, remember you told me you loved reading. He says, what kind of books do you like to read? And of course, I was going to be honest. I was going to say, I like to read documentaries. I like to read historical novels. I like to read books of science and philosophy because I didn't. And I said, I love to read novels. And it's just incredible that the Rebbe knew exactly what a novel was. And he even responded to it to say that novels don't describe real life, that it's all make-believe. And he just knew about those things. And it was really amazing that he was so on top of it and he could discuss it and explain it. And he had all the patience in the world. So you're talking about the sheitel. And that was before I was getting married, he asked me if I was going to wear a sheitel and had no problem, no hesitation at all. I said, absolutely not. And instead of him looking at me and being upset or annoyed or any kind of thing, he just smiled and he said, and why not? And then I started to explain to him that young people don't wear sheitlach because nobody in Boston was wearing a sheitel. And it was something that old women do. And I certainly was not going to do it. And I had a very lovely crowd of friends, and most of us were college students and few nice girls, but nobody was going to wear a sheitel. It just wasn't on the agenda. And then he asked me why. I said, because, this is not what young people do, and none of my friends are going to be doing it, and I have no intentions of doing it, and that's all there is to it. And then he said, well, you're planning to wear hats or cover your hair? I said, yeah, I'm going to wear hats. I was excited about wearing hats. That was like being grown up, to have hats with feathers and flowers and veils and all that kind of stuff. And that was it. And then a year later, a complete year later, because I got married to Shodesh Elul, a year later in the Seres Yemei HaTshuva, he sent me a letter. And I was just amazed that I got a letter from him, and it was addressed just to me, because usually it was to my husband and me that he would send, Rosh Hashanah greetings or whatever it was. And here, this was just for me, and I hadn't asked him anything or been discussing anything with him. And I was like really stunned, and it was a letter. And in the letter, he recalled all my arguments of why I said I didn't want to wear a sheitel. And he brought them all up, and he said, well, if your friends are not going to wear it, why can't you be the first one to wear it and be the leader? And he put the whole thing all around that this is something that he wants all the women in the Chabad to wear a sheitel, and he wants people to really influence other people, and he thinks that I could be one of the people to do it and things like that.
What year was it? What year?
1956.
Okay. So you got married in 1955.
1954. Well, 1954. Yeah, 54. Yeah. So it was 55. Well, it was like the end of 55. It was the end of 55. It was Tishrei 55. So right. I said it was 56 because that was the year my daughter was born. And I was pregnant then, and I was getting tired of wearing hats because when it was springtime and summertime and you wear a skirt and a blouse, it kind of feels silly to put on a fancy hat. It just doesn't go with it. And all the people, I was living in Crown Heights then, it wasn't Boston anymore. And everybody was wearing, not everybody, but the young women in Chabad were wearing sheitlach. So I saw it, it's not such a bad thing. So when the Rebbe said he wanted me to do it, so I told my husband to send back a note to say that I decided that I'm going to do it. And then a day later, my husband came back and said, you can't believe what happened. You can't believe what happened. And so what could have happened? You went to 770, like what's the big deal? What could have happened? And he pulled out an envelope and he says, look what the Rebbe sent to you. And he sent me a huge check to buy the most beautiful sheitel I could buy. But that was his response to make it to make you happy, to make you feel proud, to make you feel good. And he just understood all of those things. But that's only part of what he did for women, because women at that time, there was no women's lib. And it's hard to understand that. But women kind of accepted that they were second-rate citizens and things. But the Rebbe told us we should make our own newspaper. And that's when we started the Yiddishe Heim, which was a magazine. And I used to write articles for it. And then he started to say that we should be active in PTAs, which the older women had been also. But he said we should make a young Neshei Chabad, and we should have conferences and conventions. And he took such an interest in our conventions. He wanted to know what our theme was. And we would represent him 10 different choices of themes, and he would choose the theme for us. He was very actively involved in anything and everything. Every article that went into the Yiddishe Heim, he read through all those articles, and he actually corrected some of the things that he felt that words should be changed. He was very careful with phrasing and wording and things like that. And he took such a great active part in making the women rise to the occasion of being forefront runners of things.
So in continuation of that thought, how you were with Lubavitch from birth, but you were with Lubavitch in Crown Heights from the 50s till now.
Right.
At 70 years, you've seen the development. How do you explain that? What do you say? And it goes in line with all the work you've done over so many years. But this is amazing, because very few people can say they were there from the 50s till today, and Baruch Hashem, they're on Zoom being interviewed. So it's fascinating, especially, as I said, a woman, a Jewish woman, a Lubavitcher woman. I mean, this is fascinating. So you spoke about the beginning, your relationship with the Rebbe in the 50s, and his putting the foundation down for Jewish women. Now continue with the development to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and one more point. My mother, Shalom, was a survivor. She was raised in Costa Rica. She came, she married my father. He was learned in Lubavitch Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, and she, as you was, went to a public school. There was no girls' school, and there were women in Crown Heights. One name comes to mind was Esther Shagalov, who I'm sure you know, Mrs. Shagalov. And it seems to me there was like an organized group of women who were mechanech, who educated these new women of all the Lubavitcher guys, and many of them shluchim, and they married non-Lubavitcher girls. Rabbi Pinya Korf married non-Lubavitcher girl, and Sholem Marozov married non-Lubavitcher girl, and Rabbi Mendel Drizin, and Rabbi Avrami Korf, mostly did not marry. They were happy that they met a frum girl. That, my father was so happy that here's a girl that wants to, and she also got money from the Rebbe and put on a sheitel. So I always had this in mind. It seems like that there were women in the community who took the role of, educating these women to become, Chabad women. And therefore their children will continue in that way. Does this ring a bell to anything that you remember happening in the 60s in particular?
No, I think it was more the schools. I think it was more the schools, the curriculum of the schools that changed through the years. For example, if you go back to the 60s, I don't think they were teaching Tanya at that point. And that was something that was introduced later. And it was also more of an emphasis. The girls did not go to seminary in those days, because I think that past World War II period, I wasn't really here then, but I think at that time, most people didn't really have much money, and they needed the daughters to go to work because they really needed people to help to support families. Expenses were high, and people really needed every child in a large family to go to work. So people did not go to seminary. So seminary became initiated. That was a new thing. And it was really it's a way of extending education. So it was the education of the young people that really blossomed. And I think it was the young people who more or less influenced the families themselves also, because the women were too busy raising their children, so they didn't really have all that time. But then they made like Neshei Chabad, they had gatherings and things, and people had opportunities to go to classes and so on and so forth. But I think the schools had a very, very important part. And the Rebbe was Maham Chana, for example, that was something that came in for Baalei Teshuvos. That didn't exist before the 60s. There was nothing for Baalei Teshuvos. So it's really systemized school education and the emphasis of extending education. And the Rebbe was very, very not happy with people going straight from high school into college. He wanted them to be more mature and older so that they could really be able to deal with all the things that were going on in higher education.
Did Rabbi Jacobson, Rabbi Yisroel Jacobson, did you have a relationship with him as you were, growing up in the 50s and the 60s? Did you have any connection with Rabbi Jacobson? He was a friend of your father's, I know.
He was a friend of my father's, actually, yes, but he really had nothing to do with us after my father was nifter. No, not really. I was very good friends with Rachel Altein. She was one of the first people to actually become involved with the Yiddishe Heim. And she was in the English part of it. And Tema Grari was in the Hebrew part. And also the other thing was that when Shluchim went out to different places, the Rebbe was very concerned about the Shluchas, and he would send speakers from New York to come to different women's events. He was very interested in there should be women's events in all the towns, not just for men. So they would have like special events during Purim time. They would have Women's Week and so on. And they would send, I remember going to different towns to speak. And that was also a new thing, that he wanted people to come to encourage the people who were shluchas so that they should see people from New York and get a little strength from them. And all of that was part of this whole thing of women's organization, women's activities, activities for women, by women, very, very much. I don't think any other Hasidic group had that to the extent that we did.
Mm-hmm.
We even had radio programs. I remember being in the Catskills, going to a radio program and speaking on the radio every week before Shabbos. And these were all things that the Rebbe encouraged us to do.
Right. So about yourself, what did you do in the 60s and 70s? Were you teaching? Were you, I understand you led tours for many years. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I was very active in the PTA in Beis Rivka, and I took it for 1 year, and I ended up doing it for 4 or 5 years. That's the kind of thing that happened. You become involved with the school and so on. I started with the tours. That was very interesting because I loved traveling, and my husband was a shochet, and we really couldn't afford traveling. And then when my children started going to camps, and I had summer vacations because I was teaching, and summer vacations, I was off all summer, I decided I wanted to become a tour guide. And I asked the Rebbe about making my own business. I had no idea what business meant because nobody in my family, well, I had a brother in business, but my father was a Rav, and I wasn't used to the idea of business. I had no idea what it meant. And I was on the dollar line, and I hesitantly asked the Rebbe if I have an idea to make tours to Scandinavia. And the Rebbe his smile was so big, and he was so excited, and he gave me an extra $1, and he was like so encouraging about it. And he really was very supportive. And every year he would ask me to give reports what happened in Scandinavia. And every year when I came back and it was Elul time and I went for dollars, he was saying, "Was ist geschehen dem Jahr in Scandinavia?" There were no shluchim there in any of those countries. So I felt that I was the unofficial shliach that was giving regards to what was happening in all those places. And it was really, really exciting because the Rebbe really wanted to know the internal politics and so on and so forth. And he cared about every single thing that happened. I remember telling him one time, we were in a hotel in Norway up on a mountaintop. It was totally up on a mountaintop in no man's land. And my men went out before dinner and they were standing and davening outside. And I saw a man watching them very intently. And I kind of was wondering why. And then I asked him if he had any questions or anything. And he said he was an American and he was Jewish. And he couldn't believe that such Orthodox people could travel like that and come to such faraway places and just keep the religion and be so cool and comfortable of it. And he was just so overwhelmed with the whole thing. And then the next morning before breakfast, the men were outside davening and they were putting on tefillin and they were with the talesim. And it was so dramatic because you're on top of a mountain, your mamash like you feel you're touching the sky. And the atmosphere was just splendid. It was just a gorgeous day. And that man was standing there again. And as he was standing there watching it, I thought to myself, oh, wow, he really should be putting on tefillin. But I can't go up and do that. So I went up to one of the men in the group and I said, "Could you please put tefillin on that man?" And the man said, "Why?" So I said, "Oh, because he might like it." He says, "Did you ask him?" I said, "No, maybe you could ask him." And the man was very nice and he said, "I don't think so." And then I went up to somebody else and it was the same response. And then the third person said, "Okay, I'll do it." I said, "Okay." So we went up to the man, asked if he wants to put on tefillin. And lo and behold, he says, "Yes, I would love it." He says, "I haven't put on tefillin since I was bar mitzvah, and now I'm 50 years old." And then he put on the tefillin. And then at the end, he said, "Whoa, this was like the most exciting part of my whole trip. I just really felt invigorated by all this." So when I was on the dollar line, I told that story to the Rebbe. He was so happy to hear it. He was so excited. So this was part of the kind of thing that happened on my tours.
Okay, so now let's transition to the your last endeavor. the last project that you told me about. I'd like you to please share it because it's important what you're doing now.
What I'm doing now. Okay. So as a result, oh, this is so annoying. As a result of all my travels, I ended up this Katzman from across the street from me had a cable TV program.
Yes.
And yes, and years ago he asked me to do some programs on his cable TV program. So I did a program that was discussing something with somebody, with another woman, and then I did something about travel to Sweden, and I also did tours to Spain. And this woman in California was putting together a film about matchmaking in the among frum people, and she found these interviews that I had with him, and she contacted me and asked me if I could be in it. And I said, well, I'm not a professional shadchan. I've made a few shidduchim, and yeah, I'd love to, because I like to do anything. So like I'm with you now, just ask me to do something. I like to be part of things. So as she was interviewing me for that, I said to her, nobody has ever made a documentary on Scandinavia. And it's really like somebody should make a documentary on it, of how Scandinavia was there and how people in Scandinavia were supportive in Sweden of the people that came from the war and so on and so forth. And so she made a film, and it's called Passage to Sweden. And I'm a star in the film, and I do a lot of narration and stuff. And the film is being presented just so many places. She got like 8 to 10 awards for it. And we've had it presented in Toronto. We had it in Israel. I was just in Bet Shemesh in Israel, and we had a beautiful event there. And it's just very, very interesting. But can I add something on that? You didn't ask me about something else. Okay. So one of the things that came onto the scene, which I had never really thought about, how things happen in your life and you don't think about them.
They just come up.
They just come up. So I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, I had a phone call, and I was just mystified by it. A woman calls me up and she says, are you Chana Sharfstein? And I said, yes. And she says, I'm so relieved. I'm so relieved. I've been looking for you for a long time. And I'm like, who are you? What's your name? She tells me. I have no idea who she is. She says, I'm not really looking for you. I was looking for your father. I said, my father is gone a long, long time ago. Why would you even look for my father? So she tells me this interesting story that her mother had been nifter, and she was going through her mother's belongings that she had in a safety box in the bag. And in those belongings, there was a very important document. And the document had a stamp on it, a wax seal, that they used to heat up wax, and then you put a stamp into it so you could see the name where it was from, and some was official kind of thing. Yes. And in that stamp, it said, Rabbi Yisroel Zuber, Stockholm, Sweden. And she looked at this document. She knew it was very important. And the document seemed to state that her mother had been freed. And she said to me, what does that mean? I said, oh, I know what you're talking about. Then it all came rushing back to me. From the time that the first survivors came to Sweden, my father was busy night and day, day and night, day and night, night and day. That room was always filled with young women who were agunot. And they heard that my father could help them get a get.
Yeah, please explain for our audience what are agunot?
Agunot are actually women who are, I would call, chained. They are not able to go on with their lives because they don't have an official divorce from a husband. So how do you get an official divorce? That happens if the husband is alive. He can give you a get if he wants to. If he doesn't want to, there's a lot of problems to make him give you a get. But you need an official Jewish divorce in order to be able to remarry. Right. Of course, Hitler did not issue death certificates. So here was a very big problem. They came to Sweden, and all the survivors were placed in displaced persons camps, all throughout Germany and I guess Poland and in Sweden also. The men and women were in separate camps, and they used to issue weekly or bi-weekly lists of names of who was in the place, because Hitler was such a horrible person. He messed up people to such a point that nobody knew where anybody was. And so the only way you could find out if you had a sister, a brother, a family member, a cousin, anybody, was when you looked at those lists and you saw who had survived, then you could connect with them. So these women would look at the list and they would look for their husbands, right? They would have the name and the city. But if 2-3 months would go by and you didn't see the name, you presumed that the person was dead. But there was no way that my father could just take that as a sign that they were dead. So my father would have to contact people that came from the same town in whatever camps they were in Sweden where they had men, and ask them to come for interviews to say if they had seen that person in camp, if they had been with them. And everything had to be done and reported by hand, because they didn't have, I mean, these were not the dark ages, but they didn't have all the equipment, the electronic equipment that we have today. You didn't have cell phones, you didn't have computers, you didn't have ways of doing this. So it had to be done by hand, and he had to have the people personally come to him, and they had to tell all the details, and he had to write it down, and he had to get several witnesses to see if the reports matched and if it made sense. And the reason for that is because you have to be so extremely careful. So my husband must have been able to give a get to several hundred women, because there were so many young women who were left almones in those days. They were left without the get.
Not your husband, you mean your father.
My father, I'm sorry. And they didn't have the get. And in all those cases, in the hundreds of cases that he did, and he freed the women, there was only one single time that it happened, and it was just a tragedy, that the woman got the get, she got remarried, and after she got remarried, lo and behold, 3 months later, the husband reappeared.
Oh my gosh.
He had gone through woods, he had gone through hell, he had joined resistance groups, and he had ended up in Ukraine. And then it took him lots of time to come back from Ukraine to the western part of Europe. And then he came back to the western part of Europe. He looked through all these reports, and he found so great excitement that his wife was alive and she was in Sweden. So he went to Sweden, and what happens when he comes to Sweden? He finds out that she's married. And what happens when he finds out she's married? She had to divorce her new husband, and she could not remarry her first husband either. And the tragedy was so enormous to, after the war, have lost 2 husbands, that this was what my father had to avoid at all costs. So this was an enormous, enormous problem. So when I told this woman, your mother was freed, your mother must have been married. And she says, absolutely not. My mother was only married to my father. And I said, well, there would have been no reason for her to come to my father to be freed if she had been not married. And then it came out that her mother had gotten married in the ghetto, had been married a very short span of time, and then the husband had died. And then she remarried and had this woman. But that was like such a difficult chapter. And I think that was part of why my father just didn't want to stay in Europe anymore, because it was so overwhelmingly sickening and sad and tragic to hear all these people talk about their experiences in the war, that it was above and beyond words.
Right. Okay, I want to just one final thing, and then we'll finish. Although I could talk with you for so much longer, but time is short. So what would you say to the young Lubavitch girls in Beis Rivka High School, in the seminaries, all over the world? Thank God we have Lubavitch schools for Chabad schools for women all over, and Yiddishe schools, Beis Yaakov's. I mean, it's flourishing. But in particular in Chabad, and I'm asking you this because of your seniority and your you know, in Yiddish we say was durchgemacht, you know, what you went through, and you saw an entire generation. So words of wisdom, really words of wisdom, experience. So it's almost 28 years since Gimel Tammuz, the Rebbe, we don't see him, we don't hear him. There's a lot of questions that young people have. What's your message to them?
One thing that I'm very concerned about is do not be overly impressed with the world around you. Don't be overly impressed with Twitter and Facebook and all the modern technology, because a lot of that can be a tremendous amount of waste of time. I really feel very concerned about that. I think computers are fantastic and you can gain a tremendous amount of knowledge, but you have to be selective. You can go on Zoom and you can hear wonderful lectures. And while you're doing things in your house, while you're taking care of family or children or whatever you're doing, you can do a lot of learning. So I think that learning is a tremendous, tremendous importance. And I think that a lot of people, as they finish high school or seminary, many of them kind of feel that they're done with the books. You close the books and you go on, and there are so many exciting things to pull you away in different directions. And I think it's so important to know that learning is lifelong and that you always have to stick to that and you have to strengthen yourself and learn more and more and more. And I think being a level-headed, decent human being with good midas, you really need to build yourself up. You really need to have a lot of inner strength. And so there's so much time that you can waste on nonsense and being overly impressed with what's happening in the world around you. That really is not healthy. And that really is not worthwhile or meaningful. You see, like it can be so important this year. And then in the year around, it's like, forget it. That's old stuff. That doesn't make any sense anymore. So like to really know what the values are and to really enrich yourself and be very strong. And I think that girls who are not married yet and girls who are still single, I think that if you're waiting to get married, don't sit back and wait, but use your time well. Use your time, be occupied. Always be occupied, always be busy, do worthwhile things, get along in chesed activities, all kinds of worthwhile organizations and things, and be active and be the best that you can be.
And what's your feelings about Mashiach? The Mashiach's coming. No comment? I guess this is the end of the Zoom. Thank you very much.